Good afternoon. Today you will have the privilege of hearing from one of the great minds and leaders of our day, Professor Tyrone Howard. As a professor of education at UCLA's School of Education and Information Studies Urban Schooling Division, where he has served on the faculty for 14 years, Dr. Howard knows all too well the integral role of school transformation, economic empowerment, and policy building in a vibrant environment. His work is unprecedented in a variety of areas, and we're proud of him. Dr. Howard has helped California become a beacon in the area of education research and innovation. Before his work in higher education, Dr. Howard was a classroom teacher in Compton Unified School District. A Compton native himself, Dr. Howard has become one of the foremost experts on race, culture, teaching, and learning in urban schools. Having been a teacher myself and representing the region as a city councilman, state lawmaker, and now a county supervisor, I can surely say that intellectuals such as Dr. Howard truly make a difference in our community. His book, Race, Culture, and the Achievement Gap, is a bestseller examining the roles that race and culture play in educational outcomes. Dr. Howard was recently awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award for exemplary research on diversity by the American Educational Research Association. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce one of the foremost thinkers on race, equity, access, and education in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce and have you welcome Professor Tyrone Howard.
Good morning. I want to say how honored I am to be able to be with you through the wonders of technology. I do deeply and sincerely regret that I cannot be there with you in person as I had hoped to be, but due to unforeseen circumstances and some scheduling quirks on my end, I was not able to make it. It also turns out, too, that it was probably for the better because I've since had a bit of a break, which I've had to tend to as well, which requires me to have some medical attention on a hand with several broken bones that I've experienced. Nonetheless, I'm still glad that we were able to make this work. I'm honored and pleased and humbled to be able to share some time with you this morning to talk about the topic of the day. And it's really around neighborhood transformation. And this is a topic that is near and dear to me for a lot of professional reasons and personal reasons. When we talk about neighborhood transformations, what we need to be mindful of is that neighborhoods play a profound impact on how our families are shaped. Our families play a huge role on how young people develop. So when we're talking about neighborhood transformation, we're talking about really the focus or the gist of what an ecosystem does to help produce viable, healthy, vibrant young people who can become ultimately responsible adults who can make lasting impacts on their communities, in their states, in the nation, and really in the world. But I want to be really clear as we talk about neighborhood transformation today, the idea that when we talk about neighborhood transformation, I also want to use language that helps us to understand the importance of not just transformation, but also neighborhood empowerment, neighborhood enhancement. How do we take our neighborhoods and make them optimal living spaces where everyone thrives, where everyone benefits, where everyone becomes better because they've been in those neighborhoods? I was fortunate enough to grow up in Compton, California, most of my childhood. And one of the things I remember about my neighborhood was that it was a neighborhood that, despite all the rhetoric that exists that says it was a bad neighborhood or a negative neighborhood, there were people and places and spaces that were nurturing, that were supportive, that were affirming. I never once felt like there weren't caring, concerned adults and individuals who were not looking for my best interests. So that's what I am always mindful of when we talk about neighborhood transformation. We're talking about ways in which neighborhoods become these spaces where individuals thrive and grow and become the best that they can be. I oftentimes say I am a product of my neighborhood. I'm a product of the community of which I was born and raised. I'm a product of the people, the places, and the opportunities that I believe every community and every neighborhood should have. So I want to situate my time with you today talking about the essence of neighborhood transformation. But I also think that language is important here because oftentimes when we talk about neighborhood transformation, there's a tendency to talk about neighborhood transformation in a manner as if there's something wrong or something broken or something in need of fixing in a particular neighborhood. And when we talk about neighborhood transformation in the 21st century, I think we've got to shift that language a bit and talk about how neighborhoods are in need of improvement and enhancing, but we're not talking about fixing people, we're not talking about fixing families, we're not talking about fixing aspects of neighborhoods. What we're really talking about is how do we sort of take on a different paradigmatic shift where we're talking about fixing the systems and structures that have not served people well. I think the tendency becomes one of blaming the victim. Let's blame the individuals who are not doing the things that we think that they should be doing. And I think neighborhood enhancement, neighborhood empowerment has got to be more about the way that we take a long, hard look at our systems, our structures, our policies, our programs and procedures to ensure that we're doing the best in all neighborhoods, regardless of where they might be listed or where they might exist. So I want to talk about this today, but I want to do so in a manner that talks about the context and the importance of the immediacy that we find ourselves in. I think everyone there knows that as we look at the calendar, we're in December of 2016. We just recently have had a presidential election that in many ways has the potential to bring about a tremendous shift in lots of the political context of how we think about neighborhood transformation. If I can be frank and if I can be very blunt about this, this for me raises some deep-seated concerns when we have a presidential campaign that produces a president-elect that ran, in my opinion, with a strong anti-immigrant sentiment, a strong anti-woman sentiment, a strong anti-community sentiment in many ways. And so part of why I think this neighborhood transformation work is important, because in many ways we're fighting or we're engaged in a different type of battle compared to where I think many folks thought we would be just a couple of weeks ago. I think we're now having to understand that the changing political winds pose some different challenges and some different obstacles that we need to be sensitive to as we engage in the importance of transforming our communities. I think the kind of rhetoric that has emerged around building walls and the rhetoric that has emerged around registering certain folks based on their religious persuasion should give us all pause. It should give us all the time to double down and to ask what are the kinds of spaces that we want to create for all citizens. What are the kind of spaces that we want to create for all individuals in our communities? And I think the work around neighborhood transformation is pivotal in terms of how we are able to leave a lasting legacy for our children, our grandchildren, and generations beyond. So I want to really sort of frame this conversation around the context of now in light of current political realities that we find ourselves in. But I also want to talk about it from the standpoint of what role can the public play and what role can elected officials play within the context of helping to take the necessary steps to get us to where we want to be as it pertains to community transformation. So the question becomes, how do we do this? What steps do we take? What strategies are most useful? What evidence-based practices do we have that have given us real bang for our buck? How can we be cost effective? How can we be cost efficient? And how can we do so in a responsible manner that's responding to the needs of a very diverse citizenry that we live in today in 2016, 2017. But I think we have to be able to step back and ask ourselves that much of what we have done in the past may not have been the most optimal ways of doing this work, may not have been the most effective ways of doing this work. So we have to all ask ourselves, no matter what domains we do this work, be it the public sector, be it the private sector, be it nonprofit, be it governmental agencies, we have to ask ourselves the question of if what we're doing is actually having the impact that we hope and expect they would have. You know, I'm always reminded of a statement that my grandmother would always say, that the surest sign of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, yet expecting a different outcome. And I think what we have to be frank about, as painful and as difficult as it is to come to grips with the reality that we are engaging in behaviors, policies, practices, laws that were intended to have certain types of impacts on our communities, but for a variety of reasons, many of them have not had the desired impacts. And I think we've got to say time out. We've got to step back and begin to ask ourselves what has not worked and why. And I think we've got to be bold enough, I think we've got to be courageous enough to begin to say, if we take different approaches, perhaps we might have different outcomes. So as we think about neighborhood transformation, I really want to center my sort of talking points today in the brief time that I have with you around 3 key points. And those 3 key points are really around the role of education in neighborhood transformation. A second is on the role and the importance of living wages when it comes to education and when it comes to neighborhood transformation. And a third would really be around what is the role of the public sector? What is the role of elected officials to help us realize, to help us reimagine what it would be like to have neighborhoods that are self-sustaining, neighborhoods that are thriving, neighborhoods that are vibrant, neighborhoods that are inviting, and then neighborhoods that each and every person will be proud to call its own. So let's get into it. I'm an educator. I've been fortunate enough to be at the University of California at Los Angeles for close to 17 years now, and so education is my forte. And when we talk about neighborhood transformation, one of the first areas that I tend to situate this conversation is in the domain of education. And I use education as the domain because we have to understand something that Malcolm X said years ago, that education is the passport to the future. And many of us are byproducts of a wonderful education system where we receive the kind of mentoring and the support that has helped us to become the successful professionals that we are, the successful entrepreneurs that we are. And so I am concerned because I think the current state of affairs in education does not always provide young people today with the same opportunities that it provided just a generation ago. And so I want us to begin to think about some of the challenges that education faces. And I situate this conversation about education within the realm of neighborhood transformation, but I do so with a real keen eye and a real keen focus on the growing inequality that exists in our country and the widespread poverty that we see existing in many of our neighborhoods. So when we talk about neighborhood transformation, when we talk about the role of education, that cannot be done in a vacuum. It has to be done with this understanding of how we see poverty increasing in ways that is making education even more important in the 21st century than perhaps it's been in most of our lifetimes. I'm concerned because when we talk about education, we continue to see this growing chasm between the haves and have-nots. Even in the midst of school reform, we continue to see certain aspects of our population have access to high-quality schooling, high-quality teachers, first-rate technology, innovative programs, a host of enrichment activities that allows those individual students and families who have access to those schools to have the best and the brightest and to be able to think about how education really can become a tool for self-actualization. It can become a tool for the ways in which young people recognize their own promise and potential. But what deeply concerns me is that in many cities across this state, you travel to Los Angeles, where I'm from, or even in cities like Oakland and San Francisco, even parts of the Central Valley, where we have this widespread inequality that exists, where you see schools that are woefully underfunded. And what we know that what happens in those schools when they're underfunded, teacher quality is not what it should be. We have lots of research that tells us that when teachers are not adequately equipped to teach in diverse settings, to teach in high-need communities, that the outcomes for those students suffers tremendously. So we've got to find ways to shore the gaps between where those teachers are and the resources that they need to be successful. But it's not just teachers. It's also a need for strong leadership in schools. And we have lots of schools across the state that see constant turnover with regard to leadership, which we know is not the recipe for having optimal academic outcomes. And one of the areas that I've also been concerned about when it comes to issues of education has been the really growing chasm between technological infrastructures. I walk into schools across this state and I see students who have iPads and they have smart boards and they're learning the most innovative ways to engage in independent research, problem solving. They're also learning how to begin to use technology as a tool to deepen their understanding of knowledge. And that is what we have to help all our students have in order to be successful. But while I see that widespread technology and first-rate technology in some schools, I walk into other schools and it's non-existent. And I think we have to begin to say, if we're concerned about community transformation, we're concerned about neighborhood transformation, technology's got to play a pivotal role in that process, because we cannot have the new wave of children growing up in schools where they're not getting the access to the types of technology that we know are going to be important for their future development as they grow into becoming change agents in their respective communities. So I say that technology's got to be a big part of that. I would also say, when it comes to technology, we have to have a long, hard conversation about the racial and ethnic demographics of who we are as a state and as a nation. In the state of California, we have seen these changing demographics for a very long time. We are a nation of immigrants. We are a nation of diversity, and we've got to learn how to embrace our diversity. And I think California, in some ways, we've served as a model. We are a state that is a majority minority state, so I think we have to even reframe who we refer to as minorities now, because we are in a state that is majority non-white, and that means something, because demographers tell us that we'll continue to see that trend. We'll continue to grow and see an increasing number of Latino students in our schools, an increasing number of Asian American, Pacific Islander students in our schools, a consistent trend of African American students in our schools, as well as a persistent number, albeit low number, of Native American students who are in our schools as well. And so part of what we have to recognize, and the question we have to ask ourselves, is that when it comes to community transformation, when it comes to neighborhood transformation, are those children, African American children, Latino children, Asian American children, are they getting the best quality education given the role that we're going to be expecting of them to play in the 21st century? And we have lots of data that suggests that they're not. When you look at some of the outcome data in our schools, we see that black and brown children aren't getting the same kind of exposure to rich diversity in terms of literature. The literacy rates for black and Latino children is quite disturbing, which then leads to high rates of suspensions and expulsion because students are not being engaged, which then leads to the high numbers of students who are black and who are Latino and Southeast Asian who are not graduating from high school. That is a deep-seated problem that we all have to take heart in trying to address. So this is the question I would pose to all my elected school officials. I'm sure we have superintendents in the audience. We have school board members. We have to double down and have long, hard, honest, and sustained conversations about the role that race continues to play where opportunities are concerned in this state of California. In some ways, I would hope that California can really be a leader for the rest of the nation of how we embrace our diversity, of how we are really focused on equity as a real integral part of what we mean when we talk about neighborhood transformation, because schools have got to be the laboratory of innovation. Schools have got to be the laboratory of creativity. Schools have got to be the laboratory where we help to develop and shape the bright minds that will help to lead us into not just the 21st century, but even beyond the 21st century. And so I think education has got to be a big part of how we think about neighborhood transformation, where we're putting the best teachers, the best leaders, the best technological infrastructure, and we're having conversations about where are the gaps across racial and ethnic lines, so we're ensuring that everyone has the opportunity, every child, every family has an opportunity to see education as a passport to the future. So the second part of what I think we need to focus our efforts, I mentioned education in ways that education can be enhanced, is something that is really deeply disturbing for me, and I'm sure for many of you in the audience today, is this issue around living wages. And I raise the issue of living wages because we live at a time where we're seeing increasing poverty in many of our states. I mean, we are living in unprecedented discrepancies between the amount of wealth that we see in our nation, the amount of wealth that we see in our world, yet we see widespread poverty. We see widespread suffering from people who don't have the means. And so we've got to ask ourselves, if we're truly concerned about neighborhood transformation, how do we address poverty? How do we address inequality? And I think living wages is a big part of that conversation. We continue to see that for individuals who don't get access to high levels of education, they oftentimes find themselves in low-wage positions. And why this is important when we talk about community transformation and neighborhood transformation, because when we don't properly educate our young people, they become part of what I call the economic, the fringes, the economic margins. They become individuals who cannot participate in the economic well-being of our society. So when they can't do that, when they can't become self-sustaining and they can't be contributing members, far too many of them ultimately turn into more self-destructive measures and means. And so part of our neighborhood transformation is to talk about the role that school-to-prison pipelines have played in many of our communities. Much of my work has been centered on working with young men of color across the state, and when I talk to many of these young men, I hear about the kind of inept schooling conditions that they had, the fact that they were not taught skills or trades or vocation that would have helped them to be able to become self-employed, that might have helped them to become able to learn, to earn a decent wage. And so for many of these young men, sadly enough, they turn to alternative life styles to earn their income, and many of them end up incarcerated, and it becomes a vicious cycle, as many of you in this room know. This vicious cycle oftentimes results in high levels of recidivism, where we see many of these young men who end up committing a crime, spending time in an incarceration situation, in a juvenile camp or in an adult facility, only to be released and to find themselves back in that same situation within a 3 to 6 month window. We've got to do a better job to stem the tide of mass incarceration in this country and in this state. We spent in excess, in some instances, I mean, there's a report that was put out by the Justice Policy Institute that said that just in 2013, California was spending close to $200,000 per inmate in juvenile facilities across the state. I mean, $200,000 per child. I mean, that is money that could be spent in much more effective means. And so I think we have to begin to ask ourselves again, how do we respond in different ways? How do we alter and adjust the ways we spend money to ensure that we're not doing the same thing yet expecting a different outcome? So living wages have got to be a part of how we think about this work, because we can transform communities when you give people viable jobs. When you give people viable jobs that have viable wages, they can then make informed decisions. They become greater participants in the political process. They take on more leadership roles in their neighborhoods. They're also healthier. They make better choices when it comes to their medical care. So all this is interconnected. When we have better living wages, we have thriving neighborhoods, we have thriving communities. So let me add an additional point about the living wage aspect of this work, because part of what I think we also have to do is, while we need to advocate for a better living wage, I'd like for us to be able to acknowledge that there are discrepancies in that living wage. One of the areas that we've got to be mindful of addressing is the gender gap in wages. There's a book by Jean Anion called Radical Possibilities, and in that book, Jean Anion documents the gross discrepancy that exists in wages of working men compared to working women. In some instances, that gap is as much as 20 to 25 cents on the dollar less that women make for the same job compared to men. And so we've got to ask ourselves, why do we allow the gender gap to persist when we have so many women who are in the working field today? And not only is there a gender gap there, but I think we also have to be able to situate that gender gap at the nexus of where gender and race meets. Because if we look at that closely, we see that Latinas in this state have a working wage that's significantly lower than white women. We see that black women have a working wage that's significantly lower than white women for comparable jobs. And so the intersectionality of how race and gender and poverty come together, I think tells a really important story that we have to start addressing, because we see many households where women are the primary breadwinners. Women are the sole income earners, and we can't tell women that we want them to play these proactive roles in their families, but yet these women cannot find jobs and cannot find careers and cannot find occupations that are not going to pay them a wage that's consistent with what men get. And so we have to have these honest conversations and begin to look at wage discrepancy across race, across gender, to begin to say, why do we allow ourselves as a civilized nation to begin to say that we believe in equity, but yet we have gross inequities when it comes to how we pay individuals based on their gender and based on their race. The third and final part I'd like to talk about is that at the end of the day, what is it that we believe in as a nation? I raise that question because I think much of what we see with growing inequality, we have the issue of homelessness in this state that is perhaps the worst than we've seen in any other state in the nation. How do we want to be remembered? How do we want history to tell our story? And I've always been one who says that if we don't narrate our own story, others will narrate it for us. And the frightening part in that for me is that if we allow history to tell our story in a way that doesn't say what we did for those who were most on the margins, we may be looked upon as being a society that was not really as progressive as we said we were. We've got to have some long, hard conversations about inequality. We have to have some long, hard conversations about mass incarceration. We have to have some long, hard conversations about mental health issues that we don't want to address in our neighborhoods. We have to have some long, hard conversations about the pervasiveness of homelessness in our communities. Neighborhood transformation is about us really checking in with our own values. Who are we as a state? Who are we as a nation? And are we able to stand up for the principles that says that we care about our fellow citizens in ways that says we were willing to sacrifice and willing to make bold decisions and willing to make courageous steps to ensure that each and every individual here had the opportunity and had the pathway to be the best that she or he could be. To that end, the question becomes, what is it that school leaders can do? What is it that civic leaders can do? What is it that can individuals who are in the private sector do? And I think each person has to ask herself or ask himself, what is my role? What is my responsibility? I have the utmost respect for folks who choose to lead because leadership is never easy. Leadership is never convenient. You know, I always say one of the hardest things about leadership is you have to have a thick skin because people are quick to say what you don't do right, what you don't do well. You're constantly under the spotlight. So I always applaud and take my hat off to folks who step up to serve. There's a place where we have to be able to say, leaders, you matter. We have to support leaders. We have to be able to tell leaders that the work that they do can be at the real nexus of how we transform our communities. And I think we do that through affordable housing, through better schools. We have to look at the kind of food insecurities that exist in many of our neighborhoods across the state. We have far too many children who go to bed hungry every night. We have to be able to make bold decisions. So I would ask all of our leaders who are there today and intend to say, what bold steps am I willing to make today? Am I willing to enact legislation that's not about politics, but it's about people? That's not about deal making, but it's about saving lives. It's not about just changing the ways in which we do business for the sake of political acumen, but it's about making bold decisions that's going to save lives. Part of what we need our leaders to do is to double down and to begin to say, what are we doing for the least among us? What are we doing for those who consistently find themselves fighting for an opportunity, who are consistently fighting for a chance? So I ask all of us to ask, what steps have I taken? What laws have I pushed for? What policy changes have I been an advocate for? Neighborhood transformation does not occur all by itself. It occurs when each person steps up and says, I can make a difference. Whether you be an elected official, whether you be a concerned citizen, whether you're someone who volunteers at the local PTA, whether you volunteer at the local voting poll in your neighborhood. That's what leadership is all about. We change our neighborhoods when each person plays his or her role and doesn't become a constant critic of the process, but becomes someone who's an advocate of change, who says, I can make a difference. I can somehow take a small step to ensure that children who grew up in my neighborhood feel the hope and feel the pride and feel that they can somehow become whatever they put their minds to because we have all the systems and structures in place that will support their upbringing. As I said at the outset, this work is not about fixing people. It's not about fixing neighborhoods. It's about really enhancing the systems and the structures that are around people that have not been at their optimal levels. I'm asking all of us to begin to double down, triple down in some cases, to say, how can we be better? How do we have those difficult conversations, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of religious persuasion? We've got to understand that at this time and in this moment and in this context, this is about how we set aside our differences and how we come together based on what's in the best interest of all of our stakeholders, all of our children, all of our families, all of our elderly, all the folks who don't have medical insurance, folks who don't have access to high quality food. We have to ask ourselves, what is the legacy that we want to have written about us as a state? This is our time. This is our moment. We can choose to pass the buck. We can choose to criticize. We can choose to say that we have our hands tied. Or we can choose to say, you know what? Despite all the challenges that exist around me, I'm willing to step out and make decisions that may not be popular, that may not be expedient, but I choose to make decisions because it's the right thing to do on behalf of the individuals in our communities. You know, one of the other things I'd like to mention in terms of cross-collaboration is that I think we've got to do a better job as leaders in the effort for neighborhood transformation is thinking about how we work collectively to work smarter and not necessarily harder. Case in point, I spend a lot of time in schools, and we see a lot of young children who are under the jurisdiction of the probation department, who are under the jurisdiction of the Child Welfare Services Department. And part of what we have to figure out is how do we get the left hand to talk to the right hand? Oftentimes what is frustrating and what is part of our challenge is that what happens in the school where we see children 180 days a year, where children have family needs that are not being met, mental health issues that are not being addressed. We have a lot of our young people who are living through traumatic stress, yet schools are not equipped to be able to adequately serve the needs that those students have. So therefore, we have to have school districts that work hand in hand with county agencies, where they have the resources to work with the Department of Mental and Health Services, to work with the Department of Children and Family Services, where they have skilled service workers who are able to help us to find ways to work in a cohesive fashion to meet the needs that students have. Schools cannot do it alone. Social service agencies cannot do it alone. This is where county, city, state, and federal resources and expertise have to come together to ask, What is in the best interest of young people? Because community transformation, neighborhood transformation is about making sure that we all accentuate what the other is doing. We're not just expecting schools to fix issues with children. We're not expecting the public sector to fix housing. We're not expecting the folks in the medical field to address medicine. We're finding ways to bring the best and brightest together to co-sponsor legislation, define collaborative initiatives where we have schools and county agencies working on the same page to make sure that students don't go to sleep at night without food. We can take the private sector, and we have lots of philanthropic organizations. We got to get the foundations on the table as well to say how can we use philanthropic dollars to work with county dollars and state dollars. So we've got to step outside of our comfort zones in some ways to begin to work with those entities that have levels of expertise and have resources that we might not have. So that's part of our challenge. Again, if we're going to do different types of work, we have to find ways to engage in this work differently than we have for years on end. And in some cases, we have folks who are still working with the same set of actors year in, year out that we've been working for 2, 3, 4, 5 decades. And that's the way of business that has to cease. That's the way of doing business that has to stop. We have to find ways to work cross-collaboratively. We bring together folks in education, health and human services, housing, economic development, workforce development, along with our legislators. We also have to find ways to engage our faith-based communities. Oftentimes the faith communities are staples in our communities, and they have a vested interest in neighborhood transformation. This work cannot be done without their support, without their advocacy. And I think we also have to make sure that we continue to bring in the folks who have the expertise with new technologies, 21st century technologies that can ensure that we can find ways to enhance our knowledge. This is an information age we live in. And for us not to be able to access the best ways of doing business, the most innovative ways of serving our communities would be a missed opportunity on the part of all of us. So we've got to begin to think collaboratively and act collaboratively. And so I want to make another appeal to our leaders. And I put more of the focus in this conversation on leaders because leaders take the pledge. Leaders sign the oath to say that they will do everything in their powers to best serve the public. And I know that this process of leading oftentimes gets mired in a lot of bureaucracy, gets mired in a lot of politics, gets mired in a lot of red tape, and also, let's be frank, it also gets mired in a lot of partisanship as well, where I can't work with someone on this side of the aisle because we're politically at odds. When we do that, it's our citizens who lose. It's our communities who lose. It's our children and families who lose. I'm asking us to be able to think in some more innovative ways, to say, how do we put aside petty politics? How do we put aside past differences to say, how do we find common ground? I want to believe that when leaders are willing to push through and to be unapologetic in the kinds of works that they believe are core to their mission, I believe that when we get leaders who are willing to push through the bureaucracy and say, look, I was elected to serve the constituents in my respective communities. Regardless of how it might be perceived by others in this work, I'm doing this work because I believe it's what my constituents want me to do. I believe it's what my constituents elected me to come to Sacramento for, or wherever you may represent. I think we've got to stop doing the business as usual. We have too many lives that hang in the balance. We need leaders to lead like lives depend on it, because in many ways, lives do depend upon it. If we don't act with the kind of fierce urgency of now, as Dr. King has said, where we begin to say that it's not about how we can become seen in the most popular means, we're never going to create the kinds of neighborhoods that we believe are critical for our future. This is about the kind of future that we want to have, and I cannot stress that enough, that leaders have to lead. Leaders have to provide the way. Leaders cannot be bogged down in the politics as usual that has led to lots of the same kinds of outcomes where we spend lots of money, we waste lots of time, and we have poor outcomes for our families and children. We have to begin to reimagine a way of doing business as usual, to rethink the ways we engage with all stakeholders, and begin to reconstruct the way in which we want our neighborhoods to look in years to come. So I need, and I want to ask deeply for leaders to not revert back to the business as usual petty politics that have hurt us for far too long, and to begin to take bold stances, to begin to take stances that are about what's best for families, what's best for children, what's best for our future. Another issue I would hope that we can avoid in this process of neighborhood transformation is not falling prey to what I refer to as the politics of demarcation. And the politics of demarcation are really what we see happen in many bureaucracies where no one wants to tackle an issue because it's not my issue. It's not my problem. It doesn't fall in my wheelhouse. So if there's an issue with the neighborhood in terms of its rubbish, folks might say, well, that's not a city issue, that's a county issue. County folks say it's not our issue, it's a privatization issue. Who was hired to do that work? We've got to sort of step back out of this pass the buck kind of mentality where we continue to say that county, city, state, federal, somebody else has to respond. These are all of our issues. These are not county problems. These are not city problems. These are not federal problems. They're all problems for the state of California and across the nation. So I would hope that we can begin to say that if something happens in our schools, we don't just say it's for the school board to take care of, that the state steps in and say, how can we support the school district so that it has all the resources to be as effective as it needs to be. We'd also hope that the city and the city government and city elected officials would say, how can we work in collaboration with elected school board officials to do the work that we do? I'm oftentimes deeply disheartened when I see that there's such a demarcation between what happens with children in schools because elected school board officials and elected city officials rarely have conversations about how can they work together to ensure that every student has what he or she needs. I'm also deeply disturbed when it comes to issues of housing, where housing inequities are rampant in some of our communities, but the state officials don't talk to the federal officials don't talk to the local officials. We have to have leaders who say, you know what, I'm going to reach out to folks across multiple entities, be they in the state legislature or be they in the federal government, to say how can we work with local officials to find ways to meet the needs of what our citizens need. So we've got to begin to push beyond the politics of demarcation to say that that's not my wheelhouse. I'm not going to deal with it because I was elected only to deal with issues around education or only around funding or only around employment. This is all interconnected, and I think interconnected problems require interconnected solutions. And those interconnected solutions requires individuals from different backgrounds, from different political stances, from different work points to be able to find ways to establish common ground to help solve and address deeply seated complex problems. I believe we're up to the task. I believe we have to be up to the task. I think we have more resources at our disposal than we've ever had before. And I think that leadership is not about elected positions. Leadership is not about being popular all the time. Leadership is not about who has the most persuasion. It's about doing the little things that go a long way to helping each and every person to make their communities better, to make their neighborhoods better, to make their homes better, and ultimately to help our children be the best that they can be. This work is hard. It's not easy. It won't happen overnight. But I think with constant commitment, and I think with deep-seated conviction, we can all make a difference. I regret that I'm not there with you today, but believe you me, I will be part of future conversations in person. And I'd love to hear ideas. I think we have to think cross-collaboratively about how do we bring folks in different walks of this work to the table so we can find common ground, find common understanding, because I think this is where we can find solutions. This is where we find interventions to transform our communities. We're at a pivotal moment for all of us, and I would ask that we all think about what is it that we want to be said about us, and more importantly, as I leave you, is what is it that we want to leave for our children? What is it that we want to leave for our grandchildren? Even for our unborn generations, we have the duty, we have the responsibility, we have the obligation to act bold, to act courageously, and to act without fear so that we can leave a better planet, a better world, and better hope for everyone who comes after us. I want to thank you all for being here. I want you to continue to build on finding viable solutions, and I look forward to being part of future conversations with you as we continue to do everything that's in the best interest of our society. Thank you very much.